1876. Day unknown. Month unknown. I continue to live among these unusual people. Mostly, I'm treated with a kind of mild neglect, as if I were a stray dog. Everyone is polite. Everyone smiles and bows, but beneath their courtesy, I detect a deep reservoir of feeling. They are an intriguing people. From the moment they awake, they devote themselves to the perfection of whatever they pursue. I have never seen such discipline. And this is taken from a diary entry by Nathan Algren, the protagonist of the film The Last Samurai. And he's speaking here about the Japanese people whom he's residing with. And you're going to see why this quote is relevant and necessary to start this podcast episode as I move to a quote from a New Yorker profile of the person that we are going to be speaking about in this special Icons podcast episode from the journalist Margaret Talbot, who says, "It was almost inevitable that the world's greatest animator should be Japanese." It's worth noting that any conversation about animation or anime should include Hayao Miyazaki. If you've seen Spirited Away, My Neighbour Totoro, or Princess Mononoke, Howl's Moving Castle, or even Ponyo, then you know who this is. This is the co-founder of the famous Studio Ghibli and one of the most impactful animators of all time, up there with legends like Chuck Jones of Looney Tunes, John Allen Lasseter of Pixar, and of course, Walt Disney himself. Miyazaki is infamous for his relentless work ethic, and this is why it was important for me to start this podcast speaking about work ethic. Susan Napier, who wrote the wonderful biography that I'm going to be referencing and read and reread in preparation for this podcast, notes that it would be incredibly easy to write a book about him if just to repeat the words, Miyazaki went to his studio and worked really, really hard. The book here is called Miyazaki World, A Life in Art. And it's a wonderful book that I remember picking up years ago. His work has been in my life, my whole life. I remember as a child sitting with my mother, who is Japanese, and thus the influence came more naturally and easily. But I remember watching films such as Totoro. And as we'll later get into it, it is a film about childhood, but it's so cemented deeply with my childhood. I remember even rewatching Laputa, Castle in the Sky this week in preparation, rediscovering parts of my own childhood whilst watching it. The characters I loved, the characters I misunderstood, and the power of these films being not just for children, but for adults too. Something that might not be said about other films in the same genre, but is definitely true of Miyazaki's films. They are very mature adult films with mature ideas and characters well worth exploring here, as we will do as we move on in this episode. I think I would be remiss if I failed to acknowledge the famous meme format that often shows up in my Twitter feed of Miyazaki being extremely stressed, looking extremely stressed. Quotes of him speaking to how dissatisfied he is with his work, how dissatisfied he is with life that surrounds his work. An image that comes to mind is one of him leaning back, actually with a cigarette dangling from his bottom lip. And it's really funny because, you know, this meme format that's often used for creatives that may be stuck or frustrated with their work is a reflection of truth, because it's in the wrestling of this stress that Miyazaki finds a wealth of emotion that he pours into his work. There's a poster that famously hangs in the studio of Studio Ghibli that I'm excited to read to you. It says, "Please resign if you don't have any ideas. You only work when you are told. You are used to relying on others. You avoid responsibility. You lack enthusiasm. You like to complain. You often take a vacation. And you are late for work." I think this might start to speak to the intensity and what might drive some of Miyazaki's stresses. There's also a quote here from Isao Takahata that I had to include. It's actually taken from a documentary I watched about Studio Ghibli, and the co-founder of Studio Ghibli here speaks to his employees and says, "What matters is you do work that you love, and thanks to this, you gain experience. But if Ghibli stops attracting you, just quit." So again, I wanted to open with this quote from The Last Samurai because work ethic, something that is infamously Japanese, a high work ethic for high quality, is very important in the Miyazaki story because without it, none of the depth that Miyazaki uncovered would have materialized in such a prolific and consistent nature, as I'll even think to the fact that there's a recent film that's about to come out called The Boy and The Heron. It also has a Japanese title of How Do You Live, which I find to be a more profound title that I've heard has also accurately represents the themes of the film. Is actually releasing around the time of this podcast. And that film notably has a Miyazaki at the age of 82 at the helm. And so you can see the prolific nature of his work has continued for many, many years. But Miyazaki is a complex artist, to say the least. He's defined by much more than his work ethic. There's a quote here from the Miyazaki World book by Susan Napier that says, his personality is characterized more by resilience and perseverance than by depression or anxiety, with which many artists contend with. In public, Miyazaki comes across as strong-minded and assertive, although one wonders whether the touch of melancholy and even self-doubt in some of his male characters is perhaps Miyazaki's projection of difficult emotions. And Isao Takahata, the co-founder and colleague of Miyazaki, even mentions that Hayao Miyazaki is a man who struggles. He weeps, is playful, loves people, expects too much of their talents, howls at his broken dreams, becomes enraged. This is clearly a man with a lot of emotions, but he definitely feels them to their deepest element and brings them into his work. And throughout his career, he's proven to have a unique and legacy-defining, I would say, perspective that he, as Susan Napier writes, possesses the psychological depth that would make him not only a great animator, but also a great director. So, let's get into this special episode of Icons, which is a podcast where I cover artists of many domains, be it film, animation, like this one, fashion design, music, and usually I'll read a biography or two, perhaps watch a documentary alongside that, and immerse myself within the work of that master artist and distill what I believe to be the main insights that any aspiring artist or current would like to perhaps bring into their own work as we learn from the masters of these crafts. And in this episode with Miyazaki, Hayao Miyazaki, who is an absolute icon, we will learn from the insights derived from his child's perspective that Miyazaki gives us throughout his films, the crafting of female characters in Ghibli films, his obsessions. This is something I'm really excited to go over. His journey of becoming an animator before we come to how he feels about endings. So let's get into it. And how Miyazaki crafted his art, and how, as an interview that I have read was published with the title, he was a man who could not be satisfied unless he was running like the wind. Somewhere that a lot of insights can be pulled from is Miyazaki's perspective of the child. I want to start with a quote by Miyazaki that simply puts, "The child is proof that the world is beautiful." And I think this will be testament to his perspective as we'll go into the book. Miyazaki's ability to create an entire story through a child's point of view in a film such as Totoro is a revelation. And when you watch My Neighbour Totoro, you do see this. You see a brightness, a cheekiness, and an openness to wonder that the characters Mei and Satsuki have instilled within them. And it's captured beautifully within a grander setting that feels, well, actually not so much a grand setting. A lot of his films have grander settings, but Totoro is actually preserved within a countryside and has a singular house that sits within this countryside. And I will speak more to the qualities of nature and the places that he locates his stories, but it's first worth going over the fact that Totoro captures a beautiful childhood magic. The tagline for the film, usually taglines for films are boring and uninspired at best, but the tagline for Totoro was, "We are returning to you something you have forgotten." And I absolutely love this. It reminds me actually of 50 Cent and the song Nine Shots that he wrote. An interesting transition, I know, but bear with me. In Nine Shots, he actually opens with a line that includes the perspective from 50 Cent, but as a child. And it's the vulnerability and contrast to the kind of adult, mature self that we know. And instead, he shoots us back to a place perhaps forgotten. And it's this vulnerability, but it's also this excitement and interest and intrigue that children have in the world, and this wide-eyed perspective that children have. And it's beautiful how 50 Cent kind of takes us from that point and brings us through a darkening of that perspective and the nature of a child having to cater to a harsher world. But then going back to Miyazaki's work, I think of The Wind Rises, a film made in 2013, which anchors its entire movie on the open imagination of the protagonist, but as a child. The film starts as we enter Jiro's dreams, Jiro being the main character here, and we observe the vivid imagination he places into his kind of waking reality from when he was a child. And the rest of the film feels like almost like the adult version of him chasing that child's dream. And the film even ends kind of full circle, not to spoil too much of it, but placing us right back into that dreamland he had when the character was a child. So there's a beautiful thing here that you can do as an artist yourself, where you can take someone through a journey and have them arrive back at the same place that they started, but perhaps with a deepening of a perspective. It's the same, perhaps, child wonderment that they arrive back at, but now filled with experience and knowledge to go alongside that. And hopefully not too much of a darkening of that initial child wonderment that they had, like Miyazaki is able to preserve in his films. But there is actually one incident that happened in Miyazaki's life that I think definitely solidified the unique perspective he had of children and their role in the world. The story is that when Miyazaki's family had to flee Utsunomiya, which was a city that was firebombed in July 19th, 1945, which is kind of the last month of the Second World War, the firebombing actually destroyed the city to such an extent that the city was basically completely destroyed. But Miyazaki and his family managed to escape, and they did so without any serious harm, which is great. But that night will forever stay on Miyazaki's mind. It's worth here going into Miyazaki's own perspective, as he actually is quoted directly in the book here, as he says, "When I was 4.5, Utsunomiya was bombed. Even when it should have been the middle of the night, outside it was bright red or maybe pink, as if it was a sunset. Even the inside of the room was colored pink. My uncle came by with a company truck, smaller than the vehicles that we have these days. The space for luggage was really tiny. The streets that he passed along were burning, right down to the sides of the road. We covered ourselves with a blanket. We had somehow managed to get through the place where the flames were burning. My memory isn't totally clear on this, but I'm certain that I heard a woman's voice saying, 'Please, let us on.' I'm not sure if it was my memory or if I heard it from my parents and felt like I had seen it, but anyway, it was a woman carrying a little girl. Someone from the neighborhood running towards us saying, 'Please, let us on.' But the car just went on going, and the voice saying, 'Please, let us on,' got farther away, and it gradually took root in my head the way a traumatic event does." And, the book even notes here that he reflects on this, he ruminates on this consistently. And he definitely, expresses a complicated set of emotions, which include that of guilt, as his family's affluence is the thing that actually allowed him to escape. You note there that the uncle was able to bring by a vehicle for them very easily. And the affluence and wealth that was created in the Miyazaki family even, actually stems from his grandfather, who will be an important character in his life, as his grandfather was the owner, one of the directors even, of a military aircraft company. And they produced aircrafts and actually even produced steering wheels or joysticks for military planes during the war even. So a lot of his wealth was even created during the war itself. And it was the thing that actually enabled them and allowed them to be able to move so easily during the war. But you can imagine not everyone was in that position, and Miyazaki being witness to a lot of people in that situation and having such a visceral event like this stay in his mind helped build a perspective that is very unique but very complicated from such an early age. And I think perhaps this also leads to a type of resentment, especially with his parents unwilling to help the woman and her child. His brother Arata, who is another important character, actually recalls the event slightly differently, with the characters being left behind not being a woman and a child, perhaps being of a makeup of a family, but still the event left Miyazaki scarred in seeing the separation between himself, his family, their situation, and the others who equally required help but could not get it. And I want to go back to the book here, which says his persistent awareness of his family profiting from its connection to the war industry clearly deepened his sense of guilt and responsibility. It actually goes into a quote from Miyazaki himself that says, "The fact I had been raised comfortably in a family getting rich through munitions at a time when most people were suffering materially, and that in the very midst of people dying, our family was able to escape in a truck, and then we ended up abandoning people who were basically begging us to let them on. This is a memory that became a firm part of my 4-year-old self." I think it's worth noting there that he was 4 years old. This is a very, very early and fundamental memory, and will place a key perspective over the way he thinks about children, especially that of the responsibility of children. The book itself even speaks to this, about how he thinks back on that situation and how he thinks it might have changed. I'll quote him directly. "If I'd been a parent and been told by my child to stop, I think I would have stopped. There are plenty of reasons why you couldn't do that, but I still think how much better it would have been if I had told them to stop." And I think, again, if you recall the fact that he's 4 years old at this point, then it's definitely interesting to note the assumed responsibility of this 4-year-old self that he's talking about here. He believes himself to have had the power to be able to change that situation, despite only being 4 years old and being the youngest child in this makeup. And yet he felt a tremendous responsibility of that time, where he reflects a tremendous responsibility over the memory of the child that he was. And, you know, he is quite critical about the role of trauma in his work, where he states, "I do not believe that I am the kind of person who was emotionally scarred, and makes that the theme of the movies or manga that I create." But it is clear, from the outsider's perspective, that he actually does exactly this. He might reject ideas from his trauma, but it's hard to say that it doesn't influence his work, as I believe it so evidently does. In fact, I'm kind of drawn to another quote from Miyazaki where he describes his adoration for fantasy, which I think a lot of his films can sit within the genre of, and how it differs from why we believe most people are drawn to fantasy. He says, "They tell you to face reality, but at least for me, the power of fantasy was that it gave me a space to be a hero in." You know, Miyazaki throughout this book actually describes his childhood at some points almost being like shamefully pathetic, as he says, and admits to, you know, when he's older, admits to having locked away his childhood from himself. That's a direct quote. Yet we can clearly see that his work shows how much of this childhood bleeds through the seams of this apparent locker that he's placed his childhood in. So the contradictory nature of how he speaks to his work and how his work actually comes about is something that was really worth trying to navigate in order to derive true insights about. But going back to that idea of responsibility that he has for his 4-year-old self, a theme that will reoccur numerous times throughout the child characters of his films, I want to quote a beautiful line by Susan Napier, who says, "In his animations of lost and unreal worlds, the director presents catalysts for hope and action, not simply vehicles of escape." It's true that this idea of being a hero in a fantasy exists throughout his work, but it's not to say that the fantasy sits outside of reality. It is still very much part of reality. When we look at the children and the young people within Miyazaki's films, we often see characters who take on a surprisingly large amount and degree of adult-like responsibility. And they express very little kind of victim-bent pain in their fights. I want to quote the book here. Much of his childhood and youth can be seen as preparation for his career in terms of the skills he was developing, but also on a psychological and moral level. A love of drawing and visual awareness of his surroundings came with the strong sense of responsibility and an ability to work with others, if only his brothers at first. These characters, they still struggle, but they are much more realized, and they're more mature in their response to struggle. They don't whine about their struggle, for example. I immediately think of characters like Satsuki, who cares for her motherless household in My Neighbor Totoro. There's also characters like Shita and Padzu in Laputa, Castle in the Sky, that kind of combine forces to save the world from destruction. I mean, these are children characters. They have aides throughout the film. They have these pirate characters who are all adults, and they are fighting adult villains, but ultimately these are the two children who save the day. And even the film Ponyo, that features a 5-year-old Sosuke who nurtures his lonely mother, but he also copes with the aftermath of a gigantic tsunami that takes place as well. It's likely that all of this comes from Miyazaki's own experience. When he was 10 years old, his mother became sick with tuberculosis and was hospitalized. And although he would feel a need to escape from this by reading, moving to art and fantasy, and he even notes that he resented the need to be kind of a good kid during this time. But it's clear to see that he sees something honorable in a child who bears responsibilities that aren't usually associated with children. Like Totoro's Satsuki character, Miyazaki actually notes himself that at the age of 10, he could do kitchen chores, and he also cleaned the house and fired up the bath and cooked. He was a kid who had to do it all. He did all the responsibilities of an adult within the home. But still, Miyazaki's resentment comes through when he notes things like Satsuki trying too hard to be good. That's a direct quote of his. Yet when you watch the film, there is actually very little criticism in the art itself thrown at Satsuki, and perhaps the only moment being that she has an inability to be sympathetic towards her sister Mei when Mei is angered that their mother has to stay in hospital for a little while longer. But I think this is almost like a natural, necessary story device actually to create conflict in the film, because the film otherwise is quite wholesome. So I think even that moment isn't a criticism of Satsuki. It's actually just a story device in order to create a bit of tension and a moment where we want to see how this point of conflict will actually be resolved. But for the most part, children in Miyazaki's films are strong and inspiring. Susan Napier says, "These children shoulder burdens and serve as guides, not only to their fellow characters, but to Miyazaki's global audience." There's actually an expression in the film Princess Mononoke that says, "to see with eyes unclouded." And I think this perfectly represents the perspective, the one that's very unbiased and not held back with notions like unmet expectations, for example, and how that perspective is championed by Miyazaki throughout his work. But any fan of Miyazaki's work knows almost instinctually that it's really also worth looking at the female characters in his films. These characters are not unrealistic. They're not combative, feminist, anti-male characters, but real women. They struggle, and they use the good traits that are usually reserved for masculine characters to overcome these struggles in admirable ways. Miyazaki's female protagonists are characterized really with their fortitude, their intellectual curiosity, and their upbeat spirit. I think of characters like Nausicaä or Kiki or even Laputa's Shita, immediately when I think of these characteristics as well. And you never watch a female character in a Ghibli film and feel that she was used as some kind of message about women. No, these women are full 3D characters. And perhaps because Ghibli films have never made the female characters the kind of damsel in distress in the first place, there's nothing really to reject in the later films at a time when, let's say, other animated films across the industry are having to work in antithesis, almost painfully so, of their own previous creations by retelling the same stories. I'm not going to name names here. But where does this source of inspiration come from in order to write such inspired characters? Well, it's clear that Hayao's own mother is actually a great influence to these female characters, because despite her physical frailty of having had tuberculosis, Yoshiko, his mother, was, as the book writes, by all accounts, a woman of great strength of character. And actually, later on, she was actually cured of her tuberculosis by antibiotics, and she actually lived to the age of 72. So even in her physical state, she was quite strong, especially for that time. But it is ultimately less her frailty that Miyazaki seems to remember than her tough-mindedness. A side note to this is that she wasn't this intimate mother. She seemed not to be kind of praising her children, much like actually the mother characters in a lot of Hayao's movies actually do, like let's say Satsuki's mother in Totoro. In fact, actually, Yoshiko had a slight bend more towards being almost nihilistic in her attitude in life. But Arata would describe their mother as meddlesome, strong-willed, kind to others, strictly brought up, and hade. This is a complex person you can see here, and hade is a word in Japanese which means flashy or showy or even a little loud. So the complexity that sits within Hayao Miyazaki also sits within his mother. And a lot of people who have watched Laputa's Castle in the Sky will note to the character of Dola, who plays this matriarchal character within a pirate clan. And, her strength is mostly portrayed as very positive. She's able to organize and inspire her sons who work within her clan. And Dola, is a character I love, by the way, is definitely meddlesome, definitely strong-willed, and definitely loud. These qualities that Arata used to describe their mother. But a funny thing is that Susan Napier actually notes, upon discovering a photo of Hayao's mother, Yoshiko, that the similarities with Dola don't extend to the physical. Dola's this kind of large butch character, whereas Yoshiko seemed actually quite petite and delicate in her physical form. And this can be likened more to the mother in Totoro. And I just want to end here on the female characters with a quote from Susan Napier, who says, "Female characters are almost entirely distinctive, passionate, inquisitive, and crucially three-dimensional in ways that few female characters in cartoons ever are." And so the lesson here, perhaps for fans of Miyazaki, is to be able to explore the different dimensions. I mean, Miyazaki was really ahead of his time here. And what's admirable is that he never uses this. He never uses it in a way to just include diversity, but instead focuses entirely on serving the story. And it just so happens that female characters in particular in his films capture both the vulnerability that feminine characters in those sort of roles usually have, whilst also having the admirable strength to be able to get over their own fears and have the responsibility of usually masculine characters in order to save others and be selfless in their pursuit. But this ability to take a unique perspective on both children and female protagonists wouldn't come without a base of obsession, which Miyazaki definitely had a select few. It's actually, in fact, the very nature of unapologetically allowing his obsessions to take center stage in his work that actually makes me love Miyazaki as much as I do as an artist. The first obsession I want to cover here from the book is that of his obsession with planes. And, when you look at films like The Wind Rises, which is almost entirely centered on one character's pursuit of building a plane, that's a film where the influences are very heavy. But when you look at films like Castle in the Sky, Laputa, you see the main character of Padzu is actually working on a plane that might be able to take him to Laputa at the start of the film. And when you look at films like My Neighbour Totoro, it's really subtle, but the neighbor boy who lives in the town, another favorite character of mine, that character is seen to be holding a model of a plane. So these obsessions unapologetically make their way into his films. The book says, growing up after an all-out war, the young Miyazaki loved to draw military planes, an obsession that would pay off in the stunning flying scenes in his movies. Yes, there are many of those. In fact, the name Ghibli of Studio Ghibli is actually named after an Italian military aircraft of the same name. A lot of people don't actually know that. It sounds like a Japanese word, but it's actually an Arabic word in origin, which roughly translates to a hot, fiercely wind. And a lot of theories that people have associated with this definition is that Studio Ghibli was aiming and very intentional about becoming a hot new wind blowing through the anime industry, changing the future of the genre, which they did, granted. But if you stick around to the end of the episode, you're going to learn that actually Miyazaki had perhaps different feelings for the name, and we'll get into that as well. Back to the book, Miyazaki's first and enduring artistic love was for machines, starting with the red fire engines that he drew as a young child and continuing to the planes that fascinated him after the war. It goes on further to say Miyazaki likely inherited his fascinations with machinery from his grandfather, who had held patents on several inventions. I have a strong desire to be liberated from being tied down by reality, he once said, speaking of his love of drawing airships. And it's interesting because Miyazaki actually expresses quite openly that he suspects that if he was any younger or even born any earlier, then he would likely have actually fallen into the indoctrination before the war. And he feels that he would have actually been swept into dying on the battlefield. So it's interesting of him to admit that, but it's probably more a reflection of the post-war period when Japan, which was unfortunately a shattered nation at the time, had to reassess itself and focus on very practical and pragmatic things like growing the economy, and therefore provided very little kind of emotional excitement for a passionate young boy like Hayao Miyazaki. And he perhaps would have craved what Susan Napier says was an all-embracing intensity of war, and perhaps that was something he was craving. This actually reminds me of my own grandfather, and there's two similarities from his story and that of Miyazaki's. One, which is that he also couldn't fight in the war, but the reason for that was that he actually had tuberculosis, which is, of course, something that Miyazaki's mother had. And so my grandfather actually had an intellectual obsession with, countless books, movies on the war, and even owned a lot of these model tanks, which I now believe, after my grandfather passed away, that my younger brother owns. But even now, if I go to my grandparents' home in Japan, there are still remnants of that obsession through the books that surround, or the films that are available in his video and DVD collection. But this is an obsession that is not shared with my grandmother, who did experience the negative effects of the war much more dramatically, and therefore the obsession doesn't exist in that way. And so I see a parallel here between being able to live close to that time, but yet experience none of the perhaps perceived glory of that time from an outsider's view, like my grandfather had while he was ill, but also like Miyazaki had being born just towards the end of the war. I was an overly self-conscious boy, and I had a hard time holding my own fights with others, but my classmates eventually accepted me because I was good at drawing. I expressed my desire for power by drawing huge airplanes with sleek and pointed noses and battleships with huge guns. There's an interesting extension to this quote, which is, and I even found myself thrilled with the bravery of sailors who, even as their burning ships sank, continued to fire guns until the bitter end. And it's this kind of bravery that I think is often portrayed in Miyazaki's films, with characters acting without any hesitation or any moments of self-doubt. They also have these moments that reflect this quote here, like Jiro at the start of The Wind Rises actually standing up to bullies. And so even in smaller moments, from the child's perspective of standing up to bullies, to the larger moments where a fire is occurring and people are needing to be saved, like in that of Nausicaä, the main characters reflect Miyazaki's admiration of bravery and quick decision-making that comes from that bravery. Of course, there's an extension to this quote that is important to note, which is that it was only much later that I realized that in reality these men had desperately wanted to live and had been forced to die in vain. And so Miyazaki is also aware and realistic about what war efforts actually were. And this is actually an important moment because Miyazaki does contend with the complexities of war throughout his films as well. Of course, a film like The Wind Rises is slightly complex in its slight admiration for those who were able to build machinery in the war, but most of his films have characters who sit in the army, for example, as the villains. Take Laputa, with the army actually helping the villains with their plans. The army and destruction as a whole is something to be fearful of. It's a negative force that sits in antithesis to the bravery, but also vulnerability of the main characters. And I think that's again why female and children who were not usually involved in war are actually seen to be the main characters of a lot of Miyazaki's films. But back to his obsessions, it's important to note that Miyazaki's drawings did exceed that of an average person's or child's at his young age. It is undeniable that he had talent. And this is something that perhaps we don't want to admit too much about artists that we want to, learn from, because it's hard to just replicate talent, but it is undeniable. This is an important thing to note, because one of my favorite stories that I learned from this book was that he and his older brother Arata, who was older than him by 2 years old, when they were in elementary school, actually both entered a drawing competition. And to enter this, they actually drew from a second floor balcony as they overlooked the garden that they lived in, both reflecting, of course, his affluent background, but also influences his later films like The Wind Rises, that has Jiro sat on the second floor balcony looking out as he's reading about planes. But it was from this second floor that they drew the gardens and submitted those into the competitions, but where Arata, the brother, actually won the competition, but only because the teachers refused to believe that Hayao's drawings were actually done by a child. So they noted that the drawings were just too good. And, there's no way that they could have been done by this child that was 2 years younger than his older brother. So just gave the older brother the award for the competition, which naturally highlights that both of them were talented, but the younger brother supremely so, if they couldn't even believe a child had drawn it. Arata actually admits to seeing Hayao being able to draw at a level that he couldn't imitate, and noting that his younger brother had a gifted ability to, in his words, draw everything correctly. But it was this level of detail that makes its way into Miyazaki's films, as his films are unique in being able to create what critic Eleanor Cameron describes as particularity of place, which is that he's able to create stories that sit within a larger whole that was both textured and real. I actually note that when you watch Totoro, you're very quickly able to mentally map the house as well as the layout of the land around it, despite it being populated by only rivers, fields, and trees, which, if you think from an animated perspective, are either just green or blue. So Miyazaki's very intentional about creating worlds that you can easily place, and it's something that also happens in Laputa. The initial sequence all takes place in a village that's surrounded by mountains, but the mountains are very high and very steep in the way that they are placed, and there's almost this train line that runs through it, but it all works and moves in a way and that's both highly detailed, which is very unique of animation films for backgrounds to be so detailed, but also are built in a way that you can always place the characters. You know where they're going, you know where they're coming from, you know what's behind them, you know where things sit. And I think that's something beautifully done by Miyazaki. It's that kind of specificity and detail in the backgrounds that gives each moment its place. The European architecture that stands out in films like Laputa and Kiki is also worth mentioning, because despite the most powerful passport in the world being Japanese, actually less than 20% of the Japanese population actually own a passport. This is actually a reflection of two things that are happening in Japan. One, which is that a lot of people feel that their own country is beautiful enough to explore, and thus all their vacations and holidays need to be centered around these beautiful locations worth exploring. But it's also indicative of the fact that Japanese people actually lack vacations. They don't really go on holidays. They don't spend weeks at a time away from their work, and so are unable to actually utilize the passport that's allegedly so powerful. So you can imagine the European architecture actually heightens the sense of adventure and fantasy, because it brings familiar characters and ideas into an unfamiliar place. This actually reminds me of the early 1960 James Bond films, which kind of acted as first-time holidays for a lot of audiences. Film was much cheaper than flight travel at the time. But, if you look at films like Thunderball, which is in the Bahamas, a lot of people weren't traveling to the Bahamas in the 1960s. So going to watch a James Bond film very much felt obviously like an adventure in its storyline, but also in its locations. You get to see multiple beautiful locations in these films. So that was a lot of the attractive element of the artistry of the James Bond films. But this is something that Miyazaki does, because he takes the knowledge and mental capturing of his travels in places across Europe and then brings that to Eastern audiences. So even for yourself, as much as you can, see where you can take the unfamiliar and bring it to the familiar, because it's usually the melding of the two that makes for beautiful art. Drawing most definitely proves to be an obsession during his early part of his life, where Miyazaki actually talks about having to have an alibi ready to justify why he likes drawing so much. And the alibi itself isn't clear, but what he does make clear is, despite being seen as an idiot, unfortunately, by a lot of his classmates who saw him spending so much time drawing comics, he actually considered all those that didn't appreciate the potential of manga to actually be the idiots. So he was very strong-willed in his perspective, which is useful when you have an early obsession like this, to not be deterred by those who might even go as far as name-calling. But for context, at the time in Japan, most Japanese young men were actually expected to become what are the salarymen of Japan. These are people that, till this day, are still referred to as salaryman because they sit within the white-collared careers that are very fundamental to Japanese work society. You know, it was the 1950s and 60s after all. It was a time where Japan, as I mentioned earlier, had to rebuild itself after the war, and so needed this kind of army of salaryman, if you will, to build and rebuild its economy in a time that it desperately needed it. So to be sat around drawing comics, which was not really an established industry at the time, there weren't many examples of people you could look to in order to aspire to be a creator like this yourself. It's hard to establish your own social status by being a comic illustrator. Despite that, Miyazaki had a keen ability to remain true to this, and I'm so grateful that he did. He also had the obsession of reading. He liked to read a lot, and Arata, his brother, actually spoke of how he would spend his own allowance money towards things to eat, but Hayao Miyazaki would actually spend all of his money on books. But these weren't just manga. This was also books like The Count of Monte Cristo. These were English books, you know, The Count of Monte Cristo, The Three Musketeers, The Prison of Zenda, and Gulliver's Travels, which actually even gets mentioned in the film Laputa. But it's in these books that Miyazaki kind of finds his inspiration for fast-paced adventures, you know, the ones that took their characters across the world. And this is a kind of hallmark for Miyazaki's films. All of his films do this. But alongside that, he also read smaller scale dramas that didn't take characters across the world, like The Secret Garden, which immediately reminds me of when Mei discovers the sleeping Totoro inside of this secret garden that's harder to re-access afterwards when she's having to convince her family that she found Totoro. Or Heidi, which is a novel about a young girl in the Swiss Alps, which Miyazaki actually recreated in a successful 4-season TV series before he later went on to create films. So, you know, he was constantly pulling from outside influences and then creating. Ultimately, the emotions that he's trying to speak to, the themes that he's trying to speak to, they're not exclusively Japanese. The only things that are Japanese in his films are ultimately the language that the characters use, and then sometimes the setting, right? Sometimes the setting is very Japanese, but really the ideas he's trying to get to are universal, and the emotions he's trying to speak to are universal. They're not exclusively Japanese emotions. But what's most admirable here is how Miyazaki held on to his childhood obsessions for so long and allowed them to influence his career. I want to pull a quote here from Robert Greene's Mastery, as when he goes over the ideas of mastery, a key component to this is this idea of your life's task, which is often found in the childhood obsessions. So here's the quote here. As you become more sophisticated, you often lose touch with these signals from your primal core. They can be buried beneath all the other subjects you have studied. Your power and future can depend on reconnecting with this core and returning to your origins. You must dig for such signs of inclinations in your earliest years. Look for its traces in visceral reactions to something simple, a desire to repeat an activity that you never tire of, a subject that stimulated an unusual degree of curiosity, feelings of power attached to a particular action. It is already there within you. You have nothing to create. You merely need to dig and refine what has been buried inside you all along. If you reconnect with this core at any age, some element of that primitive attraction will spark back to life, indicating a path that can ultimately become your life's task. But of course, the transition from childhood to being a professional animator is also worth examining, because Miyazaki has this great quote, which I absolutely love, which says, "What rushes forth inside you is the world you have already drawn inside yourself, the many landscapes you have stored up, the thoughts and feelings that seek expression." But I think to arrive at a place where you can express and execute contemplations as you imagine them, you must first develop a mastery over your craft. In school, Miyazaki actually took painting lessons, and it was there that he had a teacher named Sato, who seemed to become not just like an art teacher, but also a mentor to Miyazaki. I think it's interesting to note here, of course, that a lot of people might see the final product of something that Miyazaki has created and might try and emulate him, but not by studying him or the story or the process like we're doing right now, but rather just by looking at that final product and trying to copy it. Now, as an example of this, if you take an artist like Tom Mitch, who is now famous for his mix of hip hop and pop and jazz in this kind of beautiful infusion, actually, he's an artist that very few people would know actually worked on his traditional jazz craft from inside a jazz youth club called Tomorrow's Warriors. You know, you can imagine here where a lot of people will try and recreate the Tom Mitch style, if you will, in that kind of infusion that I mentioned earlier on guitar, maybe, before actually first developing a deep understanding of the mastery of the jazz fundamentals like he did, the process that was required in order to get to a place where he could start breaking the rules. There's a Picasso quote I immediately think of in a moment like this that says, you know, learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist. That's a respect of process and an understanding that mastery is often required in order to get to a place where you can start really playing with the notes that you've cultivated over time. So back to Miyazaki, he's an artist that has painting, reading, painting actually in the forms of oil, but also watercolor at his disposal. You know, he had them as fundamental pillars that he studied for years before he ever got into the final form of animation. Even manga drawing was something that he fixated on completely before ever moving on to animation. And Sato, who I mentioned as his oil painter teacher, actually became a kind of older figure and mentor-like figure in his life. And Miyazaki actually has other mentors in his life that are covered in the book Miyazaki World, like his older brother Arata, as we mentioned earlier, Isao Takahata, who was one of his co-founders in Studio Ghibli, but another co-founder, Toshio Suzuki, who was actually younger than Miyazaki, but both Takahata and Suzuki, who were obviously his co-founders, were actually very prominent influences on the way that Miyazaki worked. For example, Takahata was actually working directly alongside him as another director and screenwriter, and he very much influenced and gave confidence to Miyazaki's work. It's noted that Takahata was the only person that Miyazaki was trying to please a lot of the time when it came to his creations. It was almost like he held up a mirror or a bar even for trying to exceed in order to then feel comfortable and validated that his work could go out to the mass audiences. And this is something to note here because I think it's good advice that we should, when we, for example, write. So as a writer, you should write to one person rather than thinking about pleasing mass audiences. You think about one person. And if you think perhaps, you know, think about a person with higher expectations or maybe a need that needs to be solved, or an emotion that needs to be navigated, then if you can solve something for them, or if you can create a piece of art that moves that person, then you know surely it will be able to be replicated across other people that are like that person, especially if that person has this higher level of taste or this higher expectation from your work. I think it's often good to have that person in mind, not just in writing, of course, but across any forms of artistry. And I've noted a few times across reading these biographies of artists that for an artist to take their own work seriously, especially from a young age, it usually requires someone older than them, someone who has a lot of influence to actually believe in them and communicate this belief in them. So if you're actually an older artist listening to this and you have a mentee type figure in your life, communicate the belief you have for them. You probably have a belief in them already if you see them as someone worthy of being a mentee to you. So communicate that to them, because it's exactly that confidence instilled from an older person that allows an artist to see through a perhaps long and difficult process in order to arrive at their own unique work. There's no greater power an older artist can have than to speak to the belief and confidence they have in the younger artist to become the next icon or influence. But the conversations with Sato, going back to his oil painting teacher, would prove most helpful during the kind of difficult period that almost all Japanese kids, to be honest, go through, which is known as examination hell, which is a nickname given to a period of time where all these students actually prepare for the exams that help them get into the universities. The book actually states here that the preparation for the exams is grueling if one wants to get into a first-rate university. To this day, the ticket to a respectable middle-class life in Japan. You know, I actually know a lot of family friends whose very existence in Japan became defined by this kind of hard period, this hell. And if you think about it, we here in the West really had it easy when it comes to school life. And so Miyazaki would have been a part of that. But actually, we can note here that he already seemed to have decided that this was not for him. And he states that most of his time in high school was actually in drawing manga. And in particular, there's a type of manga known as gekiga. Gekiga is a kind of darker manga. It's often more like a bleak and socially opinionated, which naturally flourished amidst the activist politics of the 1960s. And actually, Miyazaki himself was quite an activist in a few domains. But he said he discovered this kind of manga, we can quote here, during my dark days of studying for university entrance exams. In the gekiga, there were no happy endings. The artist made every effort to provide cynical endings. For a student in examining hell, this disillusioned perspective was totally refreshing. It's quite a funny sentiment because I don't know how much that is reflective of the general population of Japanese students, but it's definitely reflective of how Miyazaki thought. You know, the cynical ending for him was the liberating one. It's a weird point of contention for him at that time. But luckily for us, because the positive and lighter note of particularly the endings of Miyazaki films is very powerful, Miyazaki actually eventually turned away from that cynical work and embarked a perspective that highlights what he says, what is good. And there's actually one particular experience that's really worth highlighting here, and a story I absolutely love, that very likely gave him this shift in sentiment. When Miyazaki was 17, while in the midst of his examination hell, he went on to a third-run theater in a seedy part of town. That's a quote from him. It was here that he encountered the first full-color animated movie produced in Japan. The film's called Panda and the Magic Serpent, and it was released in 1958. Now listen to this reaction he has to viewing the film. The book notes that he remembers his first viewing in terms more commonly used for describing the beginnings of romantic love. The book then quotes Miyazaki, who says, "I was moved to the depths of my soul, and with snow starting to fall on the street, I staggered home. After seeing the dedication and earnestness of the heroine, I felt awkward and pathetic, and I spent the entire evening hunched over the heated table weeping." I love the point here of a heated table. As a side note here, a lot of artists whose interviews I've watched or autobiographies I've read, despite not being orators by professions, but people who speak for a living, they usually have a masterful grasp on words. And I think that it's almost as though their minds are constantly framing the world through an artistic lens, helping them to organize words in a way that articulates their very particular perspective. So even as an artist yourself, constantly try and see the world through that lens. It's not one to turn off and on. It's very much something that you should cherish and be pleased that you have, because it's something that gives your work more personalized meaning. I think the pure and earnest world of the Panda and the Magic Serpent was also something that greatly impacted Miyazaki, because it's from this film that Miyazaki found his favorite animated heroine, Bai Nyang, because it's that same fortitude, intellectual curiosity, and upbeat spirit that I mentioned earlier from his characters that are clearly inspired by this Bai Nyang that he loves so much. And I'm really glad he encountered this film, because it would lead him away from the bitter world of Gekiga and towards something that was more earnest and pure. a worldview that was really important for him to create work could be appreciated by people across all ages in this very timeless manner that could sit across trends of nihilism throughout culture. But I really wanted to speak to the fact that I think a lot of great artists usually have a profound moment like this in their early years, a kind of turning point that comes fraught with deep emotions and captures the imagination of the artist. You know, for me personally, I felt I had this moment when I first watched the film The Godfather. In fact, I still feel I do whenever I rewatch it. It takes me back to how something can be almost so large and yet so contained. It's like how all these moving pieces, the actors, the set design, the story, the coloring, the pacing, the mood, how it could all kind of come together so perfectly with not one thing out of place. That moment always shocks me because it makes me have the realization that all of this was done by humans, which sounds almost stupid to acknowledge as an obvious point. But when art transcends that imperfect process of human touch and arrives at this perfect package, I find that to be truly inspiring. There's few pieces of work that do that for me, and I will definitely be talking about them throughout these episodes. But The Godfather always does that for me. It just feels like something that came to be. But no, I have to remind myself, no, it didn't just come to be. It wasn't started the way it finished. It started as an idea. It started as a book. But then it later, had to go through a very arduous process where so many things would have gone wrong and so many things did go wrong. And yet it still arrived at something that I can look at and call perfect. And it's in looking at that in that moment that I can't help but be at awe when I'm reminded that it didn't enter the world this way. The co-founder of Studio Ghibli has this great quote. He says, "To be honest, none of us expected Studio Ghibli to last this long. Let's make one movie. If it's successful, we'll shoot another one. If it fails, that's it. That's how we started." And when I think of Miyazaki and I think of the Studio Ghibli films, I realize that they sit outside of the realm of their competitors. I think perhaps because the way they even structured their business, they thought about having one film. And that meant that they had to sacrifice what these kind of animation studios usually would do, which is to supplement their revenue with TV shows that they would make along the way, and then maybe spin a film out of those TV shows once they've gained popularity. But no, they focused and sacrificed this model in order to dedicate themselves entirely to what they strived for, which was this higher quality animation that only longer feature film projects could afford. But I think this one project mentality was actually crucial to this, because despite being kind of contrary to the ambitious types and artists who I also admire, who call their shot and lay out their grand master plans that span over decades, perhaps this more humble perspective on how quickly things can start, but how hard it is for them to be maintained, was exactly what was required to drive and motivate the kind of focus they had in producing the studio's films, especially their first film, Laputa, Castle in the Sky, which is a quality standard that I believe they set and maintained throughout all of their films. Miyazaki himself has threatened to retire numerous times. For example, around the time of The Wind Rises in 2013, and then more recently with The Boy and The Heron in 2023, but has actually acted against that notion both times. But to end the episode, I'll leave you with a quote from Miyazaki that speaks to something in endings, but also speaks to something that he has remained consistent on. In response to a question from an interviewer that said, "Aren't you worried about the studio?" he responded with, "The future is clear. The studio is going to fall apart. I can already see it. What's the use worrying? It's inevitable. Ghibli is just a random name I got from an airplane. It's only a name." Although I've been watching Studio Ghibli movies since I was a child, I rewatched many of the films I mentioned in the podcast in preparation for this. And so if you're curious as to what I think is actually the best piece of art that Hayao Miyazaki has ever made, I actually made a free downloadable PDF, which is available in the link of the podcast show notes, where I talk about the piece and dissect why it's his magnum opus, as well as actually summarize the learnings from this episode. I've been Justin Campbell Platt. This is Icons. Thank you for listening.